Professor Stan Taylor is acquainted with Professor Bewley-Taylor, and why don't we have Stan introduce our guest today.
I'm happy to do that. Professor David Bewley-Taylor was my mentor when I was a visiting professor at his university in Wales a year ago or so, and the strength of that American Studies department in that university. He's a dynamic lecturer. Students he's very popular with the students, I can tell you that. His is the class my students would always talk about his class. So David has written widely on the problem of international drug and international drug control and the foreign policies and politics of international drug control. His book, done for the UN Drug Control Agency, is called Breaking the Impasse, Transnational Institute Drugs and Conflict Debate Papers. His book, The United States and International Drug Control, is really one of the authoritative books on this subject. He was educated in Wales in the United States. He lectures widely. He does commentary occasionally for BBC in the UK. He's just a wonderful young man. He has 2 children and a wife back in Wales right now who are worried about his safety while he's over here with us Americans. And I have to tell you, he lives in the most beautiful bay in the world, Three Cliffs Bay in southern Wales. So that's an aside, but I think you'll enjoy getting to know Professor David Bewley-Taylor. David?
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I was wondering if Stan's been paid by the Welsh Tourist Board, actually, for part of that. Since I arrived, everyone's been apologising for the weather. I think it's wonderful. You know, I get rain at home every day. I don't get snow very often, so this is fantastic. Anyway, thank you very much. The title of my talk today, The Long Reach, the United States and the Limits to Drug Policy Liberalisation in Europe. I'm going to discuss some aspects of regime theory, some foreign policy, some fairly academic things, I suppose, but I'd like to start off with a really academic... absolutely. Can you all see that? Can everyone see that? Okay. Now, there's nothing there at the moment, but can you see the screen? Okay. I'm going to start off with a really teasing academic question for you. Okay. Does anyone know where this quote's from? Okay, give you a clue. It's more kind of popular culture than academic. Any idea? Who's a movie buff amongst you? You familiar with the work of Quentin Tarantino? Okay. Absolutely. This is a quote from Pulp Fiction. Quentin Tarantino's movie, 1994. Have many of you seen it? Film. It's kind of opening scene of the movie when you've got the character played by John Travolta and the character played by Samuel L. Jackson in the car, driving along, discussing the cultural differences that exist between the US and Europe. Okay? They talk about lots of things, including the fact that in Belgium, you have mayonnaise on your fries, not ketchup, but they also discuss cannabis and the legal status of cannabis within Europe, particularly within Holland. Okay, so bear this quote in mind. I promise it does retain some relevance for the rest of the talk. Okay, so today what I would like to talk to you about then is a little discussed aspect of the apparently increasing tensions in transatlantic relations. This is the issue of drug policy. Now, the skies above Europe may not rattle with the sound of Pentagon-sponsored Black Hawks, but that doesn't mean that we in Europe have escaped the reverberations of the long-running US war on drugs. To be sure, successive US administrations have been keeping a close eye on the illicit drug situation in European countries. And to so-called American drug warriors, as many writers term these people, threats exist in many foreign nations and indeed in many forms. So, for example, Colombia is what we call a source nation. And it warrants Washington's attention in the hope that crop eradication, so the eradication of the coca crop, and interdiction, that's stopping or trying to stop drugs, illicit drugs coming across the borders into the United States, will actually reduce illicit drug use within the United States itself. Okay, but as I mentioned, US drug policy also focuses on other countries, including the Netherlands. Now, Holland, though, I think, is under scrutiny for rather different reasons, though. And it can be argued that US concern with the Dutch has more actually to do with ideology than simple supply and demand. Put simply then, the predominantly tolerant attitudes towards drug use in the Netherlands sits very uncomfortably with the prohibitionist views held within policy-making circles within the United States. And as such, US officials sometimes openly criticise Holland's drug policy. And a memorable incident, fairly recent incident, involved this gentleman, General Barry McCaffrey, who's Clinton's drug czar. McCaffrey criticised Dutch policy and pictured it as a violent and unmitigated disaster in 1998. McCaffrey, though, if we look at the history on this sort of thing, McCaffrey was merely following a long tradition dating back to a figure that will play a prominent role in today's discussion. This guy is the original US drug czar. Now, I wonder if any of you here have any idea who the original US drug czar is, or indeed was. No? Okay, it's a guy called Harry Anslinger, okay? And he was the commissioner of the FBN, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which is one of the predecessors of the DEA, from 1930 to 1962. Incredible tenure. And most people have heard of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. Very few people have heard of Commissioner Anslinger and the FBN, despite the fact that Anslinger had a massive impact on the creation of drug policy, not only within the United States, but also overseas as well. So what I'd like to do in this presentation is examine a key mechanism by which US drug warriors, if we're going to continue to use that term in this paper, not only criticise but also defend their conception of appropriate drug policy against the spread of what they regard to be ill-conceived policies in Europe. Today there are a number of drug-related ideological rifts developing between the US and its European allies. But here I'm going to focus solely on diverging views concerning approaches towards the most widely used illegal drug on both sides of the Atlantic. What would that drug be? Just ask the audience today. Absolutely, okay, so it's no real surprise. It's cannabis. Now, before we go any further with this, I would like to add a brief caveat. Now, the field of drug policy, like many others, is occupied by what we can call hawks and doves. Yeah, you're all familiar with this terminology. There's a great deal of research and discourse surrounding the cases for and against drug policy liberalisation of one sort or another. I see my role here today, however, as that of an owl. As such, what I'm hoping to do is place one aspect of drug policy into the context of broader transatlantic relations, of regime theory, and of issues of national sovereignty. Okay, so as I'm sure you're all aware, the US continues to advocate punishment-based prohibition for cannabis possession for personal recreational use. Okay, this is the dominant paradigm for cannabis policies within the United States today. Now, this position is based on the belief that cannabis use is very harmful to both the health of individual users and to society at large. Now, while this is the case in the US, some nations in Europe are reassessing the concept of harm, the notion of harm, and are moving towards the Dutch model with the liberalisation of their drug laws. Individual sovereign states are making these moves because they're deemed to be appropriate responses to changing national circumstances. And in an increasing number of nations, this actually includes the policy of de facto decriminalisation. The long reach of the US, however, helps to ensure that no country in Europe or elsewhere for that matter, can easily go one step further and legalise the possession, production and distribution of the drug should it wish to do so. Okay, so the complete legalisation of cannabis today is highly problematic, and that's what I want to talk to you about for the rest of the presentation. So open criticism like that from McCaffrey may periodically produce public tensions between US officials and their counterparts in The Hague and other European capitals. But as I hope to demonstrate here, within the contemporary world of transatlantic narco-diplomacy, if we can use that term, the US actually works with a rather unlikely and almost invisible partner in its attempts to safeguard the constructs of its own prohibitive universe. Now, Washington has a great ally in the little-known United Nations Drug Control Treaty System, a system it's worked very hard for many years to construct and maintain. Okay, so the treaty system then forms the basis of what we can call the global drug prohibition regime. And I'll just give you a rather sort of long-winded quote from a guy called Ethan Nadelman. And he tells us that today the vast majority of world states count themselves as members of what has been called the global drug prohibition regime. States from across the globe with varied social and cultural backgrounds adhere to UN legislation based upon the prohibition of certain drugs for anything other than scientific and medical purposes. Okay? Now, because of this, the production, sale, and even possession of narcotic drugs, hallucinogens, barbiturates, amphetamines, and tranquilizers outside strictly controlled medical and scientific channels are now punished with criminal sanctions in virtually every nation. Okay? So key to this regime is the United Nations, which for many observers of US international politics and multilateralism, this may come as a bit of a surprise. And as I mentioned earlier, the prohibitive nature of the regime owes much to the prolonged efforts of the United States. Now, since the beginning of the 20th century, the US has been consistent in its intention to confront the issue of drug use from the prohibitionist perspective. And it can be argued, locate the source of domestic problems beyond the boundaries of what we can broadly define as American society. The intention, it has been argued, has been to deflect blame for domestic drug problems and ultimately eliminate behaviour deemed morally unacceptable by the dominant Protestant culture. I'll just give you a quote from the American historian Dave Musto. Musto says that projection of blame on foreign nations for domestic evils harmonised with the ascription of drug use to ethnic minorities. Both the external cause and the eternal locus could be dismissed as un-American. And I think this is important because a powerful moralistic impulse underpins what we can call the American crusade to export this prohibitive paradigm. The United States Puritan heritage not only delineates domestic attitudes to the ingestion of certain drugs, it has also long driven the nation beyond what H.W. Brands calls an exemplarist approach to relations with the wider world. Now, clearly all actors involved with the creation of any regime have a rationale for their development. That makes sense. And those responsible for their construction have purpose in doing so, and the rights and rules of regimes reflect visions of what sorts of behaviour should be encouraged or prescribed. Now, although US interest in the development and maintenance of an international system for drug control can be explained in part by the desire to limit the flow of illegal drugs into the United States itself, proselytization has also always been a fundamental concern. Even with the hard realities of realpolitik accompanying and often eclipsing the goals of US narco-diplomacy, the desire for the transnational replication of US-style prohibition has, I think, remained constant. And contemporary international legislation has gone a considerable way towards realising this goal. And we can see this if we put this debate into historical context. Now, UN policies, today's UN policies, are constructed on the foundation of a long line of US-influenced international agreements dating all the way back to 1909 with the first international meeting on the issue of drugs. Okay, and this was the Shanghai Opium Commission. And I've got a picture of that momentous occasion. Now, I'm sure you're all probably aware of various different conspiracy theories that surround the issue of illicit drugs in US culture, yeah? Familiar with CIA involvement in drugs trade in central Los Angeles, or complicity with Mujahideen? I bet you haven't heard of this one. Abraham Lincoln wasn't actually shot. He went to work at the Opium Commission. Can you see down at the front? Uncanny resemblance of the guy sitting at the front of Abraham Lincoln. It's a research area I'm trying to get funding for at the moment. So if anyone's got any funds for me to explore this fascinating facet of drug policy, please let me know. Okay, so it dates all the way back to 1909. But it was only the possession of superpower status after the Second World War that created the political atmosphere necessary for the globalization of these US ideals that had been developing since the turn of the century. And the central role that the US played in the creation of the UN organization ensured that the wider transition in the global balance of power was mirrored in the sphere of international drug control. Now, although other states were important in the foundation of the UN, I think the Charter can be seen very much as the handiwork of the US. Likewise, US prominence in the organisation ensured that its delegations to the UN drug policy-making body, a group called the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, the CND, had a considerable impact upon the creation and implementation of the UN system, and sought to develop a global regime that reflected its own ideas concerning the ingestion of certain psychoactive substances. Now, this process to internationalise the doctrine of prohibition was an important but largely ignored facet of the US quest to determine the contours of the new post-war global order. Now, it's widely acknowledged that the close of the Second World War saw the US exploit hegemonial stability to create multilateral regimes in the fields of trade and money. Just moving swiftly forward, we can see that both the Bretton Woods monetary system and the open world trade regime that's actually centred on GATT amply demonstrate this fact. Now, while these and other regimes enjoy significant attention, the global drug prohibition regime, which is a product of the same international environment, remains largely ignored. Indeed, it's generally agreed that the rules and norms of the UN treaty system owe much to the efforts of the US after the Second World War. The application of what we can call an archaeological approach to regime theory reveals that contemporary international regimes largely reflect the views of dominant states at the time of founding. And although not always entirely successful to export US-style legislation to the rest of the world, American activity between 1945 and the early 1960s certainly moved a considerable way towards the creation of an international drug control framework anchored to the doctrine of prohibition. Once again, we've got to acknowledge our friend Harry Anslinger here. Now, his work at the UN between 1945 and the late 1960s did much to ensure the prominence of US ideology. He actually retired from the FBN in 1962, but he continued to work at the UN until about 1970, 1971. He was a very influential figure. And the period, 1945 to the late 1960s, while marked by vicious infighting within the UN's drug control bureaucracy, and of course the chilly dynamics of the Cold War, can be seen as a crucial stage in the development of the global prohibitionist norm and the construction of the legal bedrock of the current regime. And this is the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs as amended by the 1972 Protocol. So as I said, we've got the Single Convention 71. This was bolstered by the amending protocol, which was also US instigated in 1972. And the regime comprises of these two instruments plus another convention in 1971 on psychotropics, and as well in 1988 it was joined by a convention effectively on trafficking of both narcotic drugs and psychotropic drugs as well. Now, ambiguity within the conventions combined with different interpretive perspectives on many of their clauses, does provide some flexibility for the nations who have signed these pieces of legislation. This is what in the trade we call, it's very technical jargon, I hope you can grasp this, we call it wiggle room, yeah? So it means exactly what it says, okay? It means that nations have a certain amount of wiggle room having signed the conventions. But what we mustn't be confused about is this point. The conventions do mean that national freedom is restricted. Okay, once you've signed these documents, there's only a certain amount of freedom of action at the national level. Now, a useful way to try and understand how this actually works, how this dynamic works, is to compare it with the domestic situation in the US between 1919 and 1933. So everyone here is going to tell me immediately what that period was known for. Yeah, okay, so what we can do is just compare it effectively with alcohol prohibition in the US. It's quite a nice comparative model. It's been argued that the single convention then stands in much the same relationship to worldwide drug prohibition that the 18th Amendment and Volstead Act stood in relation to alcohol prohibition. Just as the 18th Amendment restricted the way US states created alcohol policy, so the UN legislation limits the way sovereign states approach drug laws, yeah? So you can see the kind of synergies between the two models. Okay, so we've got the regime. So how does the regime actually work? What are the mechanisms for regime adherence? How does the regime I've just described keep nations in line in much the same way that the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act kept US states in line with regard to alcohol prohibition? Well, the mechanism can be explained by two interrelated issues: the nature of the collective system and the hegemonic status of the US. Now, obviously, as we're all aware, as events in many other issue areas demonstrates, the UN has limited direct power to determine the actions of sovereign states. Yeah, we can all think of numerous examples to illustrate this fact. As such, the image of the UN as a benevolent organisation has been crucial to the functioning of the global drug prohibition regime. Okay, this notion of a benevolent organisation is absolutely central. Okay, this is a quote from Innes Claude Jr. And he observed as long ago as 1966 that while the voice of the United Nations may not be an authentic voice of mankind, it is clearly the best available facsimile thereof. As statesmen have, by general consent, treated the UN as the most impressive and authoritative instrument for the global version of the general will. Okay? Now, by employing rhetoric stating that those drugs defined as illicit are a danger to mankind, and that the UN's ideals consequently transcend the traditional concerns of the international community, the supporters of the regime can exert considerable pressure on nations to conform to the established norms of behaviour regarding control policies. States that flout the principles of the regime and refuse or fail to abide by the norms and rules can be labelled as deviants. They thus risk condemnation by those members of the international community who do adhere to the recognised standard of behaviour. And what's been called reputational effects of non-compliance are very important here, because by reneging on their commitments under a regime or even deviating from the spirit of a regime, nations are likely to damage their reputation and forfeit potential future gains from cooperation. And the practice of what we can call linking or nesting drug control with other issue areas makes cost and cooperation important concerns. So violating a particular agreement or norm of the regime can have consequences beyond the drug issue and may affect a state's ability to achieve its goals elsewhere. And generally speaking, states, therefore, are willing to accept regime rules when they perceive the cost of compliance to be cheaper than non-compliance. So that's my first point. Now the second point talks about the US. And of course, this dynamic is greatly impacted when we include a superpower, if we put a superpower into the equation when we're talking about cost and compliance. Now, it's true that other nations do favour the prohibitive approach to drug policy. Okay, it's not just the US within the international environment. There are other states. And these states, I think, form a rather curious international alliance, including Japan, Sweden, many ex-Soviet states, and in fact most Arab states and most African states. So it's quite an interesting alliance. But it's difficult, however, to imagine any of these countries playing such an influential role within the regime. Washington's energetic support for the drug control regime ensures that states are often keen to seek compliance. By exploiting its strength on the international stage, the US can be seen in many ways then, I think, to act as a global enforcer for the more prohibition-oriented sectors within the UN. And this is particularly the case for a body within the UN called the INCB, the International Narcotics Control Board. Now, this was established by the 1961 Convention, and its role is to monitor national compliance with the conventions. And it regularly attempts to counter its lack of formal powers by effectively shaming governments into fulfilling what it, the INCB, interprets to be their sovereign nations' treaty obligations. And in recent years, the board has viewed national domestic situations vis-à-vis the treaties from an increasingly strict interpretive position. And this is a stance that is very much in line with that of Washington, and as such is sometimes bolstered by support from US administrations. So the United States' ongoing interest in the issue effectively gives the UN drug control framework the teeth that international endeavour prior to 1945 lacked. Deviation can prove costly when US cooperation in other international issue areas is at stake. And this dynamic then brings us inevitably back to the case of the Netherlands. Okay, so as I see it, Holland currently is playing a game of dare, kind of a game of legal dare with regard to the international order. Now, as I touched upon earlier, Dutch authorities have long chosen to pursue what they deem to be an appropriately pragmatic approach to dealing with drug use within their own country. I'm sure you're all aware in one way or another of the differences that operate in Holland. And while domestic political attitudes towards drug use have fluctuated over the years, and there's a bit of debate in Holland at the moment about whether the drug policies are appropriate to the particular circumstances within the country, regardless of these sorts of fluctuations, Holland still possesses among the most liberal drug policies in the world. And as you can see from this quote, the main objective of the drug policy of the Netherlands is to reduce the risks that drug use poses for the users, their immediate environment, and society as a whole. And although the risks to society are taken into account, the government has tried to ensure that drug users are not caused more harm by prosecution and imprisonment than by the illegal use of drugs themselves. And so, with regard to cannabis, what we're talking about today, the Netherlands consequently adopted de facto decriminalisation in the 1970s. So under Dutch law, possession remains a crime, but the national policy of the Ministry of Justice is just not to enforce those laws. And after 1980, the system of coffee shops, nice picture of a coffee shop there with you, with the obligatory Dutch bicycle leaning up against it. So after 1980, you get the system of coffee shops evolving, in which the purchase of small quantities of cannabis by adults was informally tolerated and then formally permitted in shops that were licensed. Now, Dutch adherence to the Single Convention and the other treaties that I mentioned has meant, however, that any socio-political desire for cannabis legalisation remains constrained. The policy would, as was noted by the 1972 Dutch Ban Commission, be inconsistent with Holland's international legal commitments. And to be sure, international circumstances prevent Dutch officials from introducing laws that move further away from the prohibitive model, should they wish to do so. And this includes ironing out some rather unusual legal inconsistencies, including the illegal backdoor supply of the coffee shops. The global drug prohibition regime has meant essentially that for over 2 decades, the Netherlands has sustained a rather unique system of regulated quasi-legal cannabis sales supplied by illegal importers and growers. So it's a very unusual and in many ways difficult relationship legally within the Netherlands. So oddly enough then, probably one of the most famous quotes, well I thought it was quite famous until I asked the question at the beginning of this class about the Pulp Fiction line. One of the most famous quotes with regard to cannabis in Holland and perhaps in any film is actually based upon probably one of the most little known aspects of the UN drug control system. Now, recent research, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, there's lots of research going on all the time about legalization and drug prevalence patterns. But recent research suggests that cannabis use patterns in the Netherlands are actually very similar to that in other nations, even the US in its pursuit of the war on drugs. To show you very quickly a rather complicated schematic from a piece of research by Ryan Arman and Cohen and Carl called the Limited Relevance of Drug Policy. And they compare two cities, they compare Amsterdam and San Francisco. And I won't bother sort of breaking down how the schematic works, but if you look at prevalence to do with regular use, less than once a week, once per week or more, or daily use, and all the different variables here, the differences between patterns in Amsterdam and San Francisco aren't as stark as you might imagine. Now, while this is the case, and other research backs this up, both Washington and the INCB continue the long-standing habit of viewing Dutch policies very critically. And make no mistake about this, the risk of reactionary international condemnation for breaking or even stretching UN law has proved to be a great factor in limiting further liberalisation. And I'll give you a couple of examples now. Okay, this is a quote from a guy called Eddie Engelsman. In 1987, he was the head of the drugs branch of the Dutch Ministry of Welfare, Health and Cultural Affairs, and he noted that Holland has a lot of international interests, both economically and in several international bodies. The Netherlands, he continued, consequently did not want to become the Libya of Europe. And that's quite a telling quote. And although Engelsman commented that threats of international sanctions hadn't been made openly, 4 years later, a colleague left no doubts about the Dutch predicament. Okay, and this is a quote from Leo Zaal, another great Dutch name. He was the chief inspector of the head office of Amsterdam Police Intelligence, and he noted their efforts to liberalise drug policies are constrained by a complex network of international treaties, which we've just been discussing, as well as informal but intense pressure from the US government. And indicating a well-established pattern of behaviour, Zaal's observations were very reminiscent of an account of the work of one of Anslinger's FBN agents, a guy called Charles Saragusa. Now, when recounting his operations abroad, Saragusa recalled that the police overseas almost always worked willingly with us. It was their superiors in the government who were sometimes unhappy that we'd entered their countries. Most of the time, though, I found that a casual mention of the possibility of shutting off our foreign aid programs, dropped in the proper quarters, brought grudging permission for our operations almost immediately. Now, it's also been said that in the early 1990s, Washington threatened heavy trade restrictions in order to encourage, and I use that term advisedly, the Dutch to halt the coffee shop system. But as the continuing existence of coffee shops suggests, the Netherlands has thus far been able to withstand any pressure. But that said, an acute awareness of the broader implications of further liberalisation has certainly restrained policy. Okay, so when you look in the press in the US, and I've noticed this just going on the internet at home looking at US newspapers, there's often a picture painted that in Europe there's a trend towards legalising drugs, and there's a very, a soft on drugs approach being picked up, and everyone is just going to copy the Dutch. That's not quite the case, although as we'll see, countries are moving towards the Dutch paradigm. Now, cultural customs and problems surrounding paradigm portability, and by that I mean just picking up the way one country approaches drug policy and putting it in another country. This means that no nation has moved as far as the Dutch authorities with regard to cannabis. And the Dutch, we should be aware, have a somewhat unique tradition of tolerance towards a wide variety of what have been considered elsewhere as kind of forbidden fruits. Nonetheless, the Netherlands has in recent years become far less isolated in its approach to dealing with drug use. And this is a quote from Danilo Bellato of the Lisbon-based European Monitoring Centre on Drugs and Drug Addiction, and he describes it really well. He says that it's a patchwork quilt of policies across Europe. You know, you can't just see it as an homogeneous whole. It's a patchwork quilt across Europe. Now, different socio-cultural and political traditions, as well as the national zeitgeist, play important roles in determining national stances. But it is fair to say that there is a clearly identifiable trend away from law enforcement-dominated approaches to dealing with illicit drug use. Now, this is taking place at the expense of the strictly prohibitive interpretations of the conventions espoused by Washington and sections of the UN drug control framework, particularly the body I mentioned earlier, the INCB. So I say that, so you say, give me some examples. So I say, okay, here's some examples. We get the softer legal stance on the possession of cannabis in countries like France. Now, France was traditionally hardline on drugs, and it wasn't prosecuting 95% of cannabis possession cases in 2001. We get more liberal approaches in countries like Spain, Denmark, Italy, and most of the German regions. Police have in recent years decided to ignore cannabis possession. In Switzerland, a nation with a traditionally pragmatic approach to drug use, there have in the past few years been moves to liberalise policies on cannabis. Now, Portugal has actually gone further than many of these countries by essentially decriminalising the possession of drugs altogether. Portuguese law now requires those caught by the police with up to 10 daily doses of any substance to appear before a non-punitive commission if they're actually cited at all by the police. And also, I think it's quite symbolic that in 2003, the UK, a country with which the US, of course, shares not only a special relationship, but also a common heritage and language, recently reclassified cannabis. I don't know, did any of you pick that up in the news? It didn't legalise cannabis, yeah? It reclassified cannabis. So its move from Class B to Class C means that possession of the drug is still illegal, but unless there are aggravating factors, it's not actually an arrestable offence anymore in the UK. Now, the quote that I just put up maybe a little early is quite apt because, in fact, I think the quote itself is quite premature, because commenting on the general trend towards more liberal drug policies, Paul Flynn, a Labour MP from Wales, from where I'm from, stated in 2001 that the drug war in Europe, at least, is essentially over. This is a bold, sweeping statement. And as such, I think it really is a little misguided and certainly a bit premature. But in relation to policies concerning drug users, US-style approaches certainly appear to be in serious decline. So that's the punitive law enforcement approach certainly appears to be in decline. Yet, as the American authors McCune and Reuter correctly note, any simple characterization of European national drug policies, particularly that they're soft on drugs, is problematic and it should be avoided, I think. There are a number of reasons for this, why we shouldn't just assume this is the case. All European nations remain committed to fighting drug trafficking. Bellata's patchwork quilt that I just mentioned earlier includes Sweden, which is a country very much in agreement with the US position on drug policy and also the INCB and its strict interpretive position on the treaties. And even among countries adopting more liberal and pragmatic positions on the issue of drug use, there is still great variation in policy at both the region and the national level. So it's certainly more complicated than we might think. But whatever your position on this issue of legalisation of cannabis, what is significant is that the discussion in Europe concerning the regulated legalisation of the drug is no longer being entertained by just the Dutch or a traditionally independent nation like the Swiss or rogue government officials who you sometimes read of in the papers, or academics or activist organisations who tend to wear tie-dyes and listen to Grateful Dead. Not that I'm generalising at all in any way here. And also international non-government organisations, INGOs, who are involved with the issue as well. While in Europe there is considerable anti-legalisation sentiment at many levels, the past few years have seen noteworthy high-level statements regarding the necessity of revisiting the conventions from a number of surprising places. And I'm sure you all know where that is. For example, in the UK, in May 2002, the House of Commons Home Affairs Committee report, the government's drug policy, is it working, recommended that the government initiates a discussion within the Commission on Narcotic Drugs of alternative ways, including the possibility of legalisation and regulation, to tackle the global drugs dilemma. Okay? So this is the House of Commons Home Affairs Committee, which is significant, I think. Even the House of Lords, often regarded as a bastion of conservatism, held a debate in June 2003 to call attention to the long-term effectiveness of national and international policies on drugs. And it's not just in the UK, also beyond the boundaries of the UK. We see examples from various places. The Greek Foreign Minister, Georgios Papandreou, stated that an objective of Greece's EU presidency was a thorough evaluation of the international treaties. And in April 2003, the European Parliament also narrowly rejected a report that called for an evaluation of the UN conventions and their classification of drugs, including cannabis. Now, although the EU's position on the treaties is confused by Sweden and its increasingly isolated stance on drugs policy, the very fact that the report was even considered and discussed at the European Parliament is, I think, significant. Okay, so we move on now to the best slide of the whole presentation, which is the conclusion slide. I know everyone always gets very excited when they see this. Okay, so bearing in mind what I've been rabbiting on about for, in fact, too long now, let's pose a question. What does the future hold for the legal status of cannabis in Europe? Well, to be frank, for the near future, at least, probably not a vast amount. I think we're going to have a continuing situation of stasis. Now, why is this fact? Well, I think there are actually a number of reasons to explain this continuing stasis. First of all, it's difficult to change the treaties. The way they've been drafted means that it's easy for groups of countries to block any change. Okay, so even if some countries feel that there is a need for change, it's very easy for a single country or group of countries to block change. So it's difficult to change the treaties. Secondly, while it's not unknown for the US to time disregard international law, most European states would be unable to and reluctant to follow that route and copy what I've called the habits of a hegemon. Political traditions and attitudes to multilateralism are very different in Europe, as I'm sure you're aware. Furthermore, threatening the stability of the drug system could have undesirable consequences on the regulation of licit pharmaceuticals, because some of the treaties actually regulate the trade in licit pharmaceuticals. So European countries are very wary about upsetting the equilibrium within the treaty system, and meaning that licit pharmaceuticals won't be as widely available as perhaps they should be. Okay, so that's important. And finally, as yet, the cannabis issue simply doesn't rank highly enough on varied political agendas for any European nation to jeopardise relations with your country, the US, the world's only hyperpower. Okay, writing in 1975, the authors of a seminal book, The Gentleman's Club, The International Control of Drugs and Alcohol, observed that, and this is the quote I've got for you here, when a superpower exhibits a high degree of involvement in international drug control, there's unlikely to be much resistance or unresponsiveness on the part of countries appealed to for support unless such support is contrary to national interests. Generally speaking, cooperation with the US in drug control matters does not conflict in any significant way with the interests of other Western countries and is therefore readily provided. And I just thought I'd show you a copy of my beloved gentleman's club there, well thumbed and well read. Now, the international landscape has, in many respects, changed beyond recognition since those words were penned nearly 30 years ago. But cannabis legalisation remains, certainly for the time being, an issue where a certain degree of cooperation is still provided. And I think the director of the European NGO Council on Drugs and Development hit the nail on the head with a comment a few years ago. Then he commented that, with regard to the drugs issue, Europe, at least at the highest political levels, is still afraid to stand in the way of the United States. And I will leave it there, but leave you with a thought: at what point will countries within Europe, what will be the tipping point for countries in Europe for them to be willing to jeopardise relations with the US over an issue to do with cannabis or any other illicit drug? Okay, and I see my time's up, so I will leave it there. Thank you for your attention.
David, is there even the slightest possibility that the United States policy towards the legalization of cannabis may be correct?
How did I know that was going to be a question? In many respects, this is an interesting field because, as I said, you've got the hawks, you've got the doves, and there's lots of research come in. Various studies linking cannabis use to psychosis, memory loss. However, when you look at cannabis within the kind of broader spectrum of harmful substances, it does seem to be an anomaly when you compare it with things like alcohol. Now, obviously we don't have no time to go into that, but that is rather a historical accident. So in some respects, that could be the case. However, cultural variation and cultural traditions make it very difficult to have a global blueprint that suits all nations. So while the policy on cannabis in the US might be fitting, one could argue that in other countries, particularly like Jamaica, where it has a deeply religious role within the culture, then US policies wouldn't be fitting. So this is the kind of problem with having a regime with a global blueprint. It's kind of a, like the socks you get for skiing, one size fits all, stretchy socks. The notion of having a one-size-fits-all global drug policy is perhaps not the best way to go. So although as I said, I see myself as a bit of an owl. I like to kind of look at it from the sidelines and not get too involved within the legalisation debate. I see problems with externally imposed legal frameworks which may not suit the culture of a particular nation or at a particular moment in time.
So would that suggest a possibility of doing away with the international regime?
No, I don't think so. I think as I mentioned, I think what countries would like to do at the moment, some countries with regard to cannabis, and this is actually being discussed at various levels, is removing cannabis from the stricter schedules within the conventions. And then it would allow governments. I mean, people aren't suggesting they would get rid of the whole regime, because there are parts of the regime that are useful, like the 88 Convention helps control of illegal trafficking. And as I said, particularly the 61 and the 71 Convention also have an impact on the regulation of illicit pharmaceuticals. Yeah, so things like heroin as well as like synthetic drugs as well. So I don't know if that answered your question or whether I bumbled enough for people to forget actually what the original question was, but that's my stance on that. Yeah. So everyone's saving their questions for TRE this afternoon. It's probably a wise move, actually.
Do you know who's doing better with keeping illegal drug traffic limited, the U.S. or Europe?
It depends what drugs you're looking at, but if you look globally, drug use of various sorts is on the increase. Now, even within the US, you get a decline in something like cocaine use, which was like heavy in the 1980s, and certainly like crack cocaine, as you're probably all aware, in the 1980s was like a big concern. So while cocaine use may be going down in the US, ATS, which is amphetamine-type stimulant use, is increasing, and that's actually increasing globally. And global patterns of cannabis use seem to be either levelling off or increasing. And then there's different patterns across different parts of the world. So it's very difficult to get kind of a global picture. But if you look at the UN data on this, the UN itself actually argues that the drug problem is not reducing anywhere, because it's kind of like a balloon effect. If one particular drug decreases in use, it's often replaced by another type of drug.
You compared the amendments to our Constitution and the Volstead Act with UN laws.
Treaties, yeah.
Yeah. How do you feel that changes the picture when it's a UN-imposed thing as opposed to the individual countries or states, if you will, making their own determination for these laws?
As I said, as we all know, the UN lacks formal power. So this notion of the image of the UN is vitally important, and then you back up that with the US being an active supporter of the regime, and then it does actually become somewhat of a straitjacket for some nations who are hoping to liberalise. So although you haven't got kind of the federal relationship that the US states had with the government in Washington, after Volstead, you still that dynamic is still there. So I think that's why I use that as a kind of an illustrative example, just to try and explain how the relationship between the law and state freedom and international law and nation-state freedom kind of operates. So although, particularly within the US, and I'm reading with great interest reflections upon Kofi Annan and the current reforms within the UN, even within the US, we would agree that there is a certain amount of respect still for the UN. Yeah, and as I kind of touched upon, in Europe there's a far stronger tradition of multilateralism. I mean, European nations aren't prone, because of their histories with conflict over the years, to disregard international law. So it is quite a serious constraint upon national policy freedom. And as I said, it's difficult for nations to actually create more space just because of the way the treaties are written. And of course, the question might be, well, if nation states wanted more freedom with regard to drug policy, why did they sign the treaties in the first place? Now, when did the drug issue become like a major concern for most nation states? Well, it was after 1961, wasn't it? Yeah, so the treaties were kind of signed pre the drug problem. And so the people who wrote the treaties and agreed to the kind of parameters of the treaties could have no idea about what was going to happen with regard to kind of illicit drug use in the 60s and beyond. Hiya.
I had a student that wrote a paper on the Dutch drug issue, and he came up with a conclusion that I thought was interesting, and I thought, I'll see if you've heard anything or have any point of view on this. He thought that it was negative that Holland and some of these other countries have it. It's de facto okay to have cannabis. It's de facto okay to smoke it in some places. But it's still illegal if you just go look at the law. I said, that breaks down the whole rule of law in these countries. And so no one really listens to it will lead to a lack of respect for law. And I thought that was interesting, but I don't know how to test it. I haven't seen it, but I wonder if you've read something about that.
Yeah, that is an argument that's often put forward, like these inconsistencies with, what laws do you obey then, if this is such a blatant illegal act, effectively. So, and I mean, this is part, often, it comes in waves, but sometimes the Dutch want to kind of set things straight with regard to the legal status, actually make it, de jure decriminalisation rather than like de facto. But that's a good comment. I can't actually remember the entire the details of it, but there's a story that a Dutch colleague of mine always tells, that his son said, well, why should I stop at a red light then when I'm on my bicycle? Because if this is actually illegal, people are doing it. And the way he tells it's obviously more full of colour and texture, but it's effectively that idea. So I mean, I'm familiar with that argument, and I think it's a valid argument. I do think it's a valid argument.
American would probably sue in court at some point, saying, well, I can break the law here, I can break
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but the Dutch, as I said, they have a very different tradition with regard to lots of issues, and so they're very pragmatic. And this is why it's a nonsense to say that everywhere is going to become like Holland, because it just wouldn't work everywhere. If a few years ago in the UK, when even before the reclassification came in, there was sort of signals sent out within one borough in London that there was going to be a kind of softening in approach to cannabis. and these kind of entrepreneurs decided they were going to set up cannabis cafes, and it just wouldn't work. I mean, the police raided it immediately, but even had the police not raided it, it just wouldn't have worked because the cultures are completely different. So although you can kind of talk about, in many respects, a kind of Americanization process just because of the nature of US kind of power, you can't really talk about a Hollandization, apart from the fact you can't say it properly, but it's a Hollandization of drug policy. It just wouldn't work. So, in my presentation today, I said that countries are kind of moving towards the Dutch liberal trend, but there's no kind of notion anywhere that everyone's just suddenly become like Dutch and they're going to have cannabis cafes everywhere. But your point about that, like the status of the law, I think is very credible, and I think the student had a very good argument. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can expound on the graph that compared the Dutch with the San Francisco, just in the use of drugs between the two places.
Yeah, I can. Even better, I can give you a copy of the paper, which I've got in my bag, because it is quite complicated. But all it does is it charts usage for like year, month, past week, and it just looks at the percentage of the overall people who were interviewed and just compares, basically the prevalence patterns of the interviewees in Amsterdam and the interviewees in San Francisco. And the differences aren't as marked as you might think. They're really actually quite similar. And the thesis underpinning that paper, as I kind of alluded to when I showed you the clip, is what is the impact of drug policy? How important is drug policy in affecting user behaviour? And according to this research, drug policy doesn't actually impact user behaviour very much. It's more to do with cultural norms. Yeah, it's actually to do with protocols established by different cultures, by drug users within different cultures. And there's a classic book published by a guy called Zimberg in 1984 called Drug Use, Set and Setting. And it talks about the group of people that you're with, and the setting where you are. And the example I always give my students is that with the use of alcohol, in Britain, if you go to your grandma's funeral, you will use the same drug that you use when you go out with your friends. You will have a beer, but you will not use it in the same way that you do when you go out with your friends. Yeah? So it's determined by the set and the setting. And this is what that research by Ryan Arman and Cohen says, really, is that drug use patterns are more determined by cultures and norms within drug user groups and within broader society than they are by drug policy. So they pose like an interesting question at the end of the day. If drug policy doesn't actually affect drug user greatly, well, what we're doing, what's the future? But that is a limited study. As a caveat, that just compares Amsterdam and San Francisco. So it's difficult to draw kind of wider parallels between America and Holland. I mean, Amsterdam and San Francisco are fairly similar cities. But to extrapolate from that wider patterns would, I think, be problematic. But I can give you a copy of the paper if you like, yeah? Okay, can I go skiing now? Yeah. Okay. Right, well, thank you very much indeed. Cheers.